after lunch. Hopefully this discussion will be stimulating enough that no one will be nodding off, and we will take a nod off as a sign of full assent and full agreement, and that's how we will proceed. We had talked just before lunch about a guidebook, and I think that is likely something that was almost universal, if not completely universal, with regards to let's do it. Now, the challenges in the discussion, or the discussion will be to decide what that looks like, what it, who will put it together, who will be in charge of making sure that it gets done, and those types of things. Legislative Council has language from different states relative to enacting guidebook statutes to put a guidebook in place, so we can potentially draw on that. They also have a wealth of other information that we may find valuable. So I know that one of the comments was made that we don't reinvent the wheel. I think Stephen mentioned that, and I would concur with that. Is there any input on that we should discuss? Is this something we develop out of whole cloth in Wisconsin, or do we plagiarize with permission someone else who has done it well? Let's just open that up for short discussion, if there is any. Yes, go ahead.
I think we plagiarize with permission, and a good place to start is the IDA website. There's a guidebook for parents, there's a guidebook for teachers and administrators, as well as other states that have, made leaps and bounds gains. Mississippi, Alabama, California. I don't know. I'd have to look. But I think we read many, and of course adapt for what we want here in Wisconsin. That's my.
Go ahead, Representative Stuck.
Well, I would say certainly we should use what's out there that we can, but I think what we really need to do is create some sort of a group or committee, or instruct DPI, or somehow set up a system where we do have a group that comes together, looks at the other resources, decide what's best for Wisconsin, because certainly while there's good things to copy from, they might not apply to everything in Wisconsin. So I think we need to set up a group that can really take an in-depth dive here to create one using some of those other resources and copying what makes sense to copy there.
Absolutely, and I appreciate that input. I think Legislative Council showed me one of the states that enacted this had a committee put together. I guess that would also then, we'd have to ask the question, is there such a body already in place that we would just say, this is an additional task of yours, or is this a task force that we set up out of whole cloth? And these are, I think, important questions to give the kind of direction that we want to see coming out of the committee as a part of it. And while you're contemplating that, another aspect of this is, who is the guidebook for? Is it for teachers and parents? Is it for, some of the states have, this is how you now comply with dyslexia legislation or other things as a part of it, and you saw that in your handout. So I guess first off, is there such a committee or task force that's already in place that we could say, you guys put this in? Stephen?
I don't think so. I think it would need to be a new group, and it would have to have broad representation. As far as the question of who it would be directed at, I know that some people hear guidebook and they think this is something for parents, so parents understand what we're doing, parents calm down and relax, and there could be some part of that, but I think the guidebook has to be for everybody. It has to be directed to everybody. It has to be about schools and districts, and even DPI in the legislature. I mean, everybody needs to understand what's in there and how that applies. I'm a little concerned, and I understand why we say it, and we all say it from time to time. I'm a little concerned about the idea that we need to look for what's going to apply in Wisconsin, what's not going to apply in Wisconsin. Reading isn't different in Wisconsin than it is elsewhere. Dyslexia isn't different in Wisconsin than it is elsewhere. Ear infections aren't different in Wisconsin than they are elsewhere. The treatment and management of these things are, we don't like to talk that way. We like to, everybody likes to think of our tribe as unique, but it really isn't. And there isn't there are aspects of dyslexia or reading that are unique to Wisconsin.
Go ahead.
I would agree totally with what Dr. Dexter just said, except for the fact that we do have certain policies, procedures, and things already in place that here in Wisconsin, we have to look at how would something like this fit into, like, for example, the multi-level systems of support that schools are required to use for working with students who struggle and some of those things. So the unique characteristics of the rules and laws that are in place do have to be considered. But otherwise, I agree
I think we would
totally, nothing-
include references to that, obviously, that they might not have a reference to the multi-tiered system of support in Georgia because they call it something else or they do it a different way. But, you know, where there are policies or procedures or structures, which, there are those things we would need to incorporate, but where there are policies, procedures, or structures that conflict with the good information that should be in the book, then those things should be fixed. We should not bend to those things.
There's another aspect of this, and I know I'm throwing out a bunch of aspects, but I figure that's one way to make the soup good at the end of the day, and that is, how is it distributed? Is it only online in some obscure place, or is it somewhere prominent, or is it like, and this is a horrible analogy, but it's one I can draw from my own experience as a remodeling contractor, talking about the continuing education units. If you work on a building older than 1978, you have lead paint notifications. Is this the kind of thing where every kindergarten student and every kindergarten parent gets a copy of a hard manual of it? Or is it something that's simply available online for parents who are at wit's end and don't have a clue? Or is it somewhere in between? So, you know, drop it from planes. But again, and you know, in legislation, we can be incredibly prescriptive with regards to that and deadlines, you know, distribution, format, deadlines, or we can be much more open-ended. So that's part of what hopefully will come out of here is some direction for Legislative Council and the LRB to put together a, you know, something that makes sense for all of us. So go ahead.
To comment that while there are consistencies, when you look across the nation, each state does have different types of dyslexia laws, how they interpret it, and the other thing is they have different people at the table. So what I heard someone say, and I don't remember, is that we do want wide representation. And one of the things I would suggest is the Department of Public Instruction has quite a significant departments with people with a lot of expertise that know a lot of resources and have wide perspectives that I think would be important. So when you're asking who would take charge of this, I think DPI would be an important place to look.
And just, I should have mentioned this on the early end. My intention is to hopefully be able to get to some kind of conclusion on this topic in like within another 20 minutes or so, like give it a half hour kind of thing. We may end up coming back around to it. I don't want to shut it off, but I don't want to shut off other opportunities as well. And this is not the final draft of legislation that we're looking at today. We'll likely have an opportunity to vote on that if we get to some kind of more or less consensus by our October 23rd meeting. And then we'll be able to, you know, to pick apart the language that we put together. So just, I should have prefaced that on the early end of the entire conversation. Vice Chair Shatner, I think you had something and I've been talking.
Thank you. I think that part of this also, I'm looking at the Minnesota guide and, you know, the diverse group of people that they have at the table, but also in what's unique to Wisconsin, I think our standards have to be considered in this here, our reading standards, what we currently do, and then how that fits into the whole practice part of this guide.
So do we want to take apart the topics one at a time? We've already, go ahead, Stephen. I'm just reflowing here.
I think standards, you know, as we talk about this, standards are going to invariably come into the conversation because we have we may have different standards in other states, and whether we're talking about standards for what students learn or standards for how teachers are prepared. But we can certainly write a guide which precedes and in some ways kind of leads those standards, because many of those standards are in a constant state of review and update. Some of those standards don't actually exist. And so, you know, because this isn't going to be, I don't envision a document here that's going to say, this is what you have to do, this is the way you have to do it. It's nothing like that. So we're more free, because we're not going to be as prescriptive, to be more aspirational and maybe more complete than we might be otherwise. Whereas in a standard, since people are going to have to live by those standards and be judged against those standards, we have to be a little bit more careful.
This is a handbook for teachers, parents, who else? Administrators?
Anybody who's interested.
Okay. Go ahead.
I see two guidebooks, one for parents, one for teachers and administrators, with some specifics, especially the teachers and administrators, spelled out as to what is needed for dyslexic students, especially at the beginning.
You just made our lives a lot more complex, giving us two handbooks. Can we have it one handbook with two sections?
And I'm going to make it even worse. I think we've got to start with a definition of dyslexia.
Well, we'll get there. We'll get there.
And I think we hand it out to everybody who's at proficient level or below.
Representative Stuck?
I would say my preference would be to have it for educators and for parents also, or families.
That's Minnesota's model. There are other states that have legislative, or have more direction in it for compliance, but we have so little in terms of laws in the books in Wisconsin regarding that compliance isn't an issue, and we don't want to do that, in my estimation. So, go ahead.
I would just say, just based on what we heard today about sometimes educators might not know, it sounds like that they may not have full understanding of what some of the laws are or what they're supposed to be doing, it sounds like what we heard. So that's why I think it might be helpful to have that for the educators also.
Or even we've gotten letters from teachers who were unaware of resources until they looked on their own, which is what teachers do. They love their kids, they love educating, and they want to do that and do that well, and so they'll look for things that are maybe not the norm. So do we have a decision point here? How should I proceed here, Legislative Council? I'm trying to,
Well, we have, I guess, it kind of depends on whether or not you want to get into precise language in terms of drafting, in terms of whether or not you want to get into the language. I can give you some sample language from other states about, least prescriptive to more prescriptive legislation.
would you do that?
That could be
Yeah.
a starting point. So here is a example from Alabama, and this is, I would say, on the least prescriptive end. So the Alabama State Department of Education, working with the Dyslexia Advisory Council, appointed by the State Board of Education, shall develop and maintain a dyslexia resource guide for the use of local education agencies, public schools, teachers, and parents. And that's all that's written.
And no deadline to that?
There's no deadline. Other states do have a deadline. They also have, other states, a mandate to review every so often, perhaps every few years. And then other states yet, and if you want me to get into those examples.
Yeah, get into a very prescriptive one, or a
Okay.
more prescriptive one if you can.
Sure. A more prescriptive one would be the state of Illinois is a bit more prescriptive, which states that the State Board of Education shall develop and maintain a handbook to be made available on its internet website that provides guidance for pupils, parents, or guardians, and teachers on the subject of dyslexia. The handbook shall include, but is not limited to, guidelines for teachers and parents or guardians on how to identify signs of dyslexia, a description of educational strategies that have been shown to improve the academic performance of pupils with dyslexia, and a description of resources and services available to pupils with dyslexia, parents or guardians of pupils with dyslexia and teachers. The state board shall review the handbook once every 4 years to update, if necessary, the guidelines, educational strategies, or resources and services made available in the guidebook.
Donna, I believe you had something you want to add.
Okay, from the, Education Commission presentation, there were types of state guidebooks, and there's 3 different types that I see. Technical guidance and support for teachers and school staff, that's one category. The second is resource guides for teachers and parents. And the third is guidance, resources, and compliance requirements. So we're talking about, I think, just something technical, and then a guide for teachers, and then there's one with compliance requirements, so that's more law binding. And the guidebook components, there's 7 of them. One is definition of dyslexia, characteristics of dyslexia, screening and process and tools, intervention and instructional strategies, teacher and parent resources, information on special education evaluation and assessment process, and state policy requirements and overview. I think it's important that we outline how in-depth we want this guidebook to be and what its purpose will be. Because if we have the purpose, then we know, if we have the why, we'll know what to do.
WSRA would be concerned about a very prescriptive guidebook. As Dr. Dykstra said, that just before that it's aspirational and not prescriptive, because it depends on, there's a wide variety, as we know, of perspectives around this topic. And when we become prescriptive, we start narrowing the expertise of the professional and what they're able to do.
Point is taken and understood in both your accounts. This is, of course, drafting legislation to put a guidebook into place, not being prescriptive as to the content of the guidebook. So, just to make a differentiation there. So the point will be, who does it? Is there a deadline? Who does it address? And how often is it reviewed? Potentially, you could have a number of those kind of things. I personally liked the Illinois language. It didn't tell you how to teach. It basically just said to include some things, but they were fairly high level, as I recall. I guess further discussion. Go ahead, Representative Stuck. Sorry about that.
Well, I just have a question about, in other times when groups or committees like this have been formed, is there ever anything restricting in terms of saying who can't be on it? Because I'm just curious if there'd be a way to somehow protect against having somebody with a financial stake. I mean, just in this realm, we know there's a lot of people that sell products regarding dyslexia, and just making sure that nobody's at the table just simply for financial gain, but really there for the best interest of the students. I mean, is there a way, has it ever been done before, in terms of just saying, like, somebody with a financial stake in it or selling a product maybe couldn't be part of it? I mean, or other thoughts on that in terms of just making sure we have the right people at the table?
Sure, and have a broad voice. I mean, I frankly think that outside of me as a legislator, the group that's here together today would be a great group to actually decide that. But that's not the purpose of what we're doing today. And this group has a shelf life, if you will, of December 4th. But who else is going to know enough to? Maybe we just say, Ledge Council, you put together the group. Wouldn't that be great? But
Vis-a-vis your question, the committee could choose to define membership in any way it chooses, including by limiting membership for someone who has a financial interest, which could be put in a non-statutory definition. So it could, if it chooses to, limit membership in that way.
My question has to do with, are we going to focus on a dyslexia guide? Or when I look at the Minnesota one, it's, for parents, and it's when a child is struggling with reading or dyslexia, which keeps it very broad. I mean, if we just focus solely on dyslexia, we are not you know, that's putting out a whole group of parents that maybe their kids are struggling with reading. And is there a difference?
And I suppose it's a question for legislative council. How does that work with regards to where the parameters of our committee are set? Is that the kind of thing that could be added? I mean, can we address anything beyond that without? Yes. I assumed as much.
Read the language again. I think there is a sentence in there that covers us.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and the answer was yes from legislative council that, yeah, we can, obviously, we can come up with any legislation we want here to put to the full legislature. And, you know, whether or not that, I just wanted to make sure that we weren't being confined in some fashion by. Okay, okay, excellent. Yeah,
Not just dyslexia instruction, dyslexia intervention and remediation, reading instruction.
okay. Okay, yeah. Yep. Should, this is from legislative council, and I'm so happy for these professionals. I got to tell you, these, Jessica and Julia have been absolutely phenomenal to work with on a weekly basis as we put things together. But the question is, so who, maybe we should know who is going to actually create the guidebook so that we can possibly work backward. Is that a task force or a group that is created? Temporary, permanent? Is it DPI that does it? Is it something that is, you know, I guess that's, who is going to create that?
At the risk of suggesting that I have a constituency, if there is a strong element, there's a strong group of people who are very concerned about this meeting, that if we decide to do this guidebook and we put too much of the control of it in DPI, that's not going to go over well. DPI has been in control of a lot of things that have not gone over well, and I think part of what we need here, just as there is some concern about that this group is not broad enough in terms of its representation, some of that happened because of a reaction to the fact that all previous groups were also not broad, but they were narrow in a different way. So this group can't be narrow, and it cannot be controlled by the people who've controlled everything so far.
Is there, Donna, I think you were going to say something, and then,
Well, I would like to see some parents involved. There's different organizations. Decoding Dyslexia, for one, is highly parent-involved. I'd like to see that present on this committee, on this workforce, or various other organizations that want to be, definitely some parents and teachers, administrators, all should have a voice.
Kathy next, and then Representative.
I don't think we should paint DPI all with the same brush. I think they have a wealth of knowledge and expertise amongst their staff. And also, I think we should have parents of non-dyslexic students as well, as we take a look at a wide perspective that of legislation that could possibly impact a lot of different students.
Point understood. Representative Stuck.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think ideally, you know, in my thought on it, that DPI would be charged, we would essentially charge them to create this with some guidance in terms, I mean, just because they are the state's education agency. I mean, this is what they're supposed to be doing and in charge of. But we would give them some direction ideally, maybe who should be on it in terms of, you know, saying, hey, you need to set this up and get this going. But we would outline, you know, we want parents on there of kids with dyslexia. We want somebody with dyslexia on it. So I think we could charge them with the kind of representation we want and put that in there. But ultimately have them be in charge of setting it up with our parameters set in terms of representation.
I think that is a suggestion that makes a lot of sense to me. We do have other committees and councils that are at the state that are very prescriptive with their membership in terms of X amount from this interest group, X amount from this interest group. And I would suggest that, you know, the things that I've heard so far seem to make a lot of sense to me. I would like to see some of the people like Decoding Dyslexia. I know they were instrumental in putting guidebooks together in some of the other states, to have them have a voice at the table. If we do that, is that then the final, does the final product and the authority to deliver that final product come from them, or does that ultimately rest with DPI or some other organization? Go ahead. Maybe I'm off the ranch already.
No,
but,
I just wanted to add a consideration that we will be asking within this discussion that may tie in to this issue. How the product will be distributed may give you a pointer to what responsible entity you want to house it in, because in some states, to avoid some of the costs of publication and distribution, they have required it to be posted on the state education agency's website and school district websites. And we have some examples of materials we require by statute for school districts to place on their websites and make available. So just thinking about who's distributing it, and if you aren't hiring planes to distribute it, how will it be posted and who's responsible for housing it, if you will?
okay. Go ahead, Vice Chair Sadler.
I think, you know, when we're looking at this here, I think it's important to have who's at the table is, you know, critical, but we have to also remember that we are a state agency. So it seems like that's naturally who's going to be distributing it and doing all this here. That's the process that we're in. We the Department of Education, so we can set up the parameters, the guidelines, what we want in it. But figuring out who these people are, a well-rounded group of people to come up with this document is clearly where the feet hit the sand. We have to make sure it's a good, well-rounded group.
Donna, go ahead.
I think we need to look at other states and what they did. First and foremost, there's, I don't know. There are at least 20 states that have put guidebooks together. My second concern about DPI is that they have two outstanding uncompleted projects hanging out there that weren't completed, and the takeaway I got from their presentation was they have no money and they have no time and resources. So I have concerns about them taking over yet another project at the scope of this project, which is huge. And, you know, that's just my opinion.
Well, and I would say to that is, I would see a deadline with regards to a formation of the body to put this together, and then of the finished work product, that would be a date sensitive. And we could make it not, you know, day after tomorrow, but certainly have hard and fast deadlines in place that would have, you know, deadlines. I don't know that you could put financial teeth to that because it's the state, but it is what it is. So if the state were doing it to a private contractor, they could put financial teeth to that. But Ann, I believe you had something to add.
I wanted to second what Donna said. And couldn't this committee put together the group? Do we have to go through DPI? Because I also heard DPI saying that they have so many sticks in the fire and so many different concerns across the state that, you know, they couldn't get us the results of several things that we asked for. They just couldn't compile it. They needed a half-time person just to compile studies that they did 2 years ago. So I would, you know, maybe we need DPI to come in after we have a rough draft or something, but, and I also would like to have Wisconsin branch of IDA represented besides Decoding Dyslexia, but.
Oh,
I mean, we are a study committee for dyslexia, so let's not forget that.
And I don't know that we could appoint ourselves to put together a guidebook. I think that would be kind of, you know, a little bit presumptuous, just saying, but that's,
Not even a rough draft?
go ahead, Deb.
I guess I would say, first of all, I agree that DPI has to be the place to do this, especially if there's going to be long-term use of it, because that's the place that people will go for information, whether it is schools or parents. That's it. One of the things with timing or distributing something like this is it has to be available just in time. You know, you could give it to the parent of every kindergarten student as they come into school, and most of them will throw it in the circular file as they walk home and will never look at it again until the time their child is struggling and they need it. So it has to be available in a way that you can find it when you need it.
Yeah.
The other thing is that WSRA would be very concerned about an overrepresentation of any one group on this, on that task force or whoever is going to put this together, because there are so many issues that come into play. And while we absolutely recognize the issues that parents of students with dyslexia deal with, we also have to recognize that some of those are beyond the control of the schools. And there are lots of things that have to come into play on how students are going to get support. It doesn't, you know, as an educator, I can tell you that nobody I know goes around saying, oh, I don't want to work with this particular child, or I don't want to deal with this particular issue. It's a matter of how do we juggle it all and give all the kids the right amount of support, or the available amount of support. And we would be very concerned about the possibility of privileging one group of students over another. We definitely don't want, I mean, I have no problem with, there are some things that need to be done, absolutely. But we also have to be very careful, because there are a lot of kids who struggle for a lot of other reasons, and they need to be taken into account as well.
So, sorry, Brenda, or Nancy, sorry.
A thought that keeps running through my mind is what seemed to really give the Minnesota Department of Education some initial success with their guidebook was the process that they went through. And the fact that this is a very complex, education itself is complex, learning how to read is complex, and every single person at this table and in other places has a very valid perspective. And the way that they brought together all of these different perspectives and put their non-negotiables on the table and facilitated a process that broke down some of the silos and built consensus. And that they each agreed, everyone had to agree to support, post the paper, and host a joint presentation at the end. So yes, it might be housed on a DPI website in the end, but they were going out to their organizations and presenting about it and posting it about it and committing to supporting it. And it's that process that gives anything in that any legs.
Yep.
You know, irregardless of what is on paper, if we don't bring people with all these different perspectives together to find ways to improve our current system, to support all students, all struggling readers, including dyslexics, it doesn't matter what we invest on paper. And so it's that process that's essential.
And we'll frankly have to trust that task force or whatever it is to be able to have the ability to do that.
Difficult conversations.
Our conversation is one step back from that. Who comprises it, and how prescriptive do we become with regards to the makeup of that task force? Or do we say that, do we put an organization in charge of, this is the one who will choose that task force? I guess and I'm not sure how to get to, we got a lot of decisions on this that we want to give to the drafters right now, not relative to the content, relative to the process.
Could I suggest that we look at the list of people who participated in the Minnesota process and determine if there are any additions to that or minuses? Because, you know, irregardless of how a person feels about decoding dyslexia or the Wisconsin DPI, they're key players in our state. They need to be involved in the difficult
I want to be
conversation.
clear, I, in no way did I want to give the impression I thought DPI shouldn't be at the table. I don't even mind, I certainly agree that this has got to be disseminated through DPI and housed on their website. What I was careful about was going out and just telling DPI, hey, DPI, put a team together and go do this, because that's just not going to fly. And I share the concern of overrepresentation. You know, my perception is that all of these kinds of panels and groups and work groups for years have been wildly overrepresented with one group of people, and that's why, you know, a lot of times nothing happens. But I think your point is absolutely critical, and I think we have to remember that from the folks in Minnesota, is that they went through this very difficult process, and they committed to this very difficult process, and we need somebody who's going to help us with that. Somebody's got to help us with that process.
Dr. Warren, I think you had something.
Just to piggyback a little bit, I guess this is jumping ahead a little bit, but if we were to go down the path of somehow, and I don't know if you legislate this or not, but having DPI have a dyslexia specialist, I think they would be in a good position then that person would potentially. Well, yeah, I know, but I mean, but anyway, I just throw that into the mix too.
And legislative
Is
council.
it- Yeah.
Good.
And Jessica just said that that's who led it in Minnesota, was their equivalent of their DPI's dyslexia specialist.
Right, and that wasn't actually something that was done legislatively, so that was something that was done outside of that. So as Julia pointed out, it's a little bit apples and oranges, but I think what we're gonna do on this, because we've talked about the task force, or I'm assuming we'll call it a task force, we'll give legislative council, they've listened to what we've all said, and they will put together a membership list, if you will, not the people, but the entities that should be part of this, and they will bring that back to us next time, and we can take a look at that and, beat it up and decide. That being said, if we allow them to do that, then we already know who we're, basically going to be addressing with this, parents, teachers, and guardians. Do we want to put deadlines in for the selection of the task force? What is a realistic deadline? Go ahead.
If I may, yes, I agree we should put deadlines in, and I'm wondering if we ask the legislative council to put together the task force, if we provide them with the Minnesota model, with the information that came
yes.
from Minnesota.
Yep.
Of all of the state models we've seen and looked at, and I agree with Nancy, that's the strongest. It's diverse. It's a group of people that got together with a very explosive topic. Mm-hmm. They worked together, they went out, they presented, and it became successful. I think there's something to be learned from Minnesota.
Yeah, legislative council, just in complete understanding, would not be selecting the committee members or the task force members for this. There would be simply, they're putting together, this is what the committee who would comprise the committee in terms of roles and responsibilities and advocacy.
Right, I understand that.
So-
And Minnesota has those roles and responsibilities that
yes,
they use,
yep.
and that was my point. I didn't mean they were gonna select the
Yep.
people. Thanks for the clarification.
Go ahead, Kathy.
I'd just like to say that while I was impressed with Minnesota's process, I'm not sure that the people at the table, I don't know, I'd have to take a look, are all, represent a wide perspective. It's possible that the people at the table, maybe we're all within, for example, the special education realm. So while I think we should have broad representation, and maybe we might want to take a look at who comprise their task force, and then we might want to make adjustments to that.
Go ahead.
I guess so. For clarification, as the committee was discussing, I wrote down some entities that people kind of tossed out there in terms of who they wanted to be represented on the advisory council. So I'd like to read off a handful of those and then have the committee add or come to a consensus upon the deletion of individuals from that committee, so that we're not creating the committee over at our offices, but rather it's being done here. So, and again, these are just names people have tossed out. So for the advisory committee, I have DPI, parents, individuals with dyslexia, decoding dyslexia, a representative from the Wisconsin branch of IDA, school administrators, and again, the language would be that the advisory committee must include but is not limited to these individuals. So I would be open to other membership that the committee wishes to add.
I would also like to add something about who.
Go ahead. Yep.
If I could also just add something I noticed in the Alaska legislation that created their task force. The final arbiter of membership was appointment by the House Speaker and the Senate President of their legislative bodies.
Okay, okay.
So I think that.
Yeah, we
in
need to have a
addition to-
component in there of that sort.
Correct.
Yeah.
In addition to who you want represented, which can be in the document creating this requirement, you'd want to name who is selecting the members to fill those roles.
Okay. And does that make sense in Wisconsin to have that be, those people be the final authority on who comprises it? Or should it be the governor and the superintendent of DPI, for instance, which tend to be from other parties? Not that that necessarily matters, but that's been kind of more the history of things. Again, I don't want, I don't like political things. I'm just trying to make sure that we have good representation. How are other committees, or that's an Alaska thing where you have, the top two. We have other councils that are set in, who is typically,
Generally, if the legislature creates the body, it designates who is going to be on that body in
and
the
it
final.
typically would be the legislative, it would be the
Those-
legislative
Right,
side.
but
so.
as we noted in Minnesota, theirs is not created in statute, so we don't know who selected the membership. But since they housed it in their Department of Education, they most likely selected the membership with primary leadership of that dyslexia specialist who spoke to us. But, I mean, the legislature didn't determine who that would be to select members because the legislature wasn't the origination
yeah.
of this guidebook activity.
And in the legislature, just in full disclosure, we don't tend to like to give over, if we come up with an idea in the legislature, we like to make sure that we're seeing it through. So it would make sense to have it be the legislative body, the leadership of it in some fashion or the other. I don't know, Senator Schottner or anyone else. Go ahead, Deb.
I just would like to say, first of all, that WSRA, the Wisconsin State Reading Association, would really expect to have a member on that committee. And just a personal point is our children should not be political pawns. So I think we have to be very careful about that.
Agree entirely. Yep. Go ahead.
Could I make another suggestion for a position? It'd be a classroom teacher, as well as a reading specialist, whatever they're represented from.
Dr. Warren, sorry,
That's okay. Another suggestion also would be someone from Department of Education, university professor representation. Also, I know parents are on the list, and I wanted to go back to Kathy's comment about having a parent whose child does not have dyslexia. And I'm curious how you would see that person contributing to a guidebook for dyslexia.
Because I heard the conversation being that the guidebook is not just dyslexia, but children with reading difficulties, then if we are creating a guidebook that's just not for dyslexic students, then a parent of someone that has reading difficulties that's not dyslexic would be an important.
Oh, okay. I thought you said that, originally I heard you say a parent whose child doesn't have problems with reading, so that
No,
clarifies
I said
things.
non-dyslexic.
Okay. Yeah, and I interpreted that to be a good reader, but that's not what you meant. Okay, thanks.
Go ahead, Ann.
In the legislature, we have the Education Committee. I think maybe that would be a guiding group of legislators.
Is that, I thought of that, are there any committee memberships in the assembly that are, I mean, I know that there's confirmations on the Senate side of appointees, if I'm correct, but does that happen? Is that a body that could decide?
A standing committee?
Yeah, a standing committee. Could a standing committee decide who comprises the membership of a task force?
Standing committees are formulated to consider and vote on proposals that legislators put forward. And so they don't create proposals themselves the way that a study committee does. This is a very special group. But standing committees, they take things that are proposed and they consider them.
Okay.
Rather
And they
than
don't typically
initiating.
appoint,
Correct.
so, okay. So, yeah, go ahead, Senator Shaw.
Well, when you look at the Minnesota model, everybody that is contributors, there are no legislators. So it's all professionals. So I think having a diverse group of professionals, parents, putting together this here document is good.
And that probably would be a common addition, is to have the leadership of the standing committees on education be part of the body that creates the guidelines.
Oh, okay, so what Senator Schottner said is there aren't any, and that's good, and you're saying
Oh,
in
no, I'm
our-
saying it's an option.
Yeah,
In Alaska, for example, they are, and
okay.
So that's like everything else.
up to us.
Yep.
Up to you.
I think it'd be a great time for me to take a 20-minute restroom break and let Senator Schottner figure this out from here, but I won't do that.
I was thinking the same thing.
Donna?
In looking at the Department of Education document from Minnesota, they included all these folks, and I really would consider looking at that. They have trainers and coaches in reading and dyslexia. They have regular ed and reading teachers, something we didn't talk about. Interventionists, which is a different animal. So, okay. Did we talk about administrators, principals, assistant principals to be on this? Special educators, coordinators. So I think that would be of value. Say that again?
They had their university involved also.
Right.
And I was going to throw in the QEC, which I don't know much about. I don't know if that's good or bad, the Quality Education Council. Just to mention another name.
Perhaps I could just read off, or Julia, the list that we currently have since we've received more suggestions.
Sure, I'll go ahead and start over with the list for the advisory council. DPI, parents, somebody with dyslexia, a representative from Decoding Dyslexia, the Wisconsin branch of IDA, a representative from WSRA, the parent of a struggling reader who is a non-dyslexic struggling reader, school administrators, classroom teacher, a reading specialist, a representative from the School of Education, leadership from the legislative standing committees relating to education, regular education teachers, special education coordinators, and I'm sorry, the last one here,
QEC.
QEC.
Can I ask what QEC is?
I don't know.
Quality Education Coalition, I believe, council?
think I went to a couple of their meetings like a long, long time ago. I don't know how much goes on. I mean,
Just from Google, the only thing that's popping up for me is Quality Education Company in Saudi Arabia. I don't think that's.
That's not it.
I've been to Saudi Arabia, no, it's not them. Well, we could probably strike that unless there's more clarity there that Brenda and then,
I'd also like to add, in addition to education, university representation, somebody over here talked about the critical importance of having the scientific community that's doing scientific reading research and education work together. I think it would be important to have somebody from, an example would be Dr. Seidenberg, who's a cognitive psychologist who does reading research. That's the kind of person that I'm referring to.
The other person, or not person.
May I clarify before we move on?
Sure.
Are you speaking of a brain development specialist science?
Yeah, they're usually in cognitive psychology, neuroscience, I don't
So a
know.
researcher on the brain
Right, as
science of-
opposed to a practitioner who's working with children or teaching teachers how to teach is kind of what I'm referring to.
Thanks for
I'm
clarifying.
going to speak the dirty truth, which is that you can say brain scientist and people will march forward people that I would say are not brain scientists. And I would demand somebody else. I mean, everybody in this room who's been part of the struggle over the last 10, 15, 20 years, right now is sort of counting heads as we go through this. And everybody's trying to imagine, so who would that be and how would the count come out? I think the most important thing is that the diverse views in this are evenly balanced. Regardless of what organizations they come from, that they're evenly balanced. So that there is an honest and open discussion, so that neither side can simply say, to heck with you, we've got enough votes in the room, we don't need you. That can't happen.
well, and that would be playing politics with our kids, not in an R&D side, but in a different philosophical
Like they did in
side, so.
Minnesota, people have to be in a position where they have no choice but to listen.
And, the thing that I haven't brought up, because I don't know how to even address it right now, but is, how does this council then comprise itself? Is there a chair and vice chair, and who is that? Those are things that, I don't know that we can, but I think we probably ought to spell out, but I don't know how to spell out. Maybe the legislative members of that become the chair and vice chair, and it turns into a de facto committee like this, but with the specific idea of putting together a guidebook. We also need to decide who has the final say on this. Alaska said Speaker of the Assembly or House and the President of the Senate. Is that the way we do it in Wisconsin? Is that the way we have historically chosen those? I think it is it not?
Rural schools task force, the ones I can think of, that's the typical
That's the
approach.
typical approach, okay. So,
Just the ones I'm familiar with.
yeah,
I've been here 5 years, so that's not very long in
Yeah.
legislative history. That's just what I'm familiar with.
but that would be kind of normal procedure, so go ahead, Kathy.
I could say if we can accomplish a balanced task force or committee, I appreciate Dr. Dykstra's comments. And in light of that, when we talk about someone scientific, there are, as we know, different viewpoints from the science community. So I think we should have a balanced approach of that as well.
Well, and we'll get a chance, when we have legislative council put together kind of the membership criteria for next time, we can look at that, and I'm assuming that we'll get a document possibly to look at prior to next meeting with regards to our, so you'll have a chance to, pull it apart and come with any input that you have prior to us actually taking a vote to say, let's go ahead and do this. So Representative Stuck and then Nancy.
I just want to throw out another possible member for this group would be a member from one of the CISAs, since they do advise and help the school districts.
Okay, Nancy?
And the one that I'd like to add is speech and language. That was not in the Minnesota group, and it was brought up today as being an important voice in the process.
Well, then a deadline becomes important, because I'm hearing about 19 or 20 people so far on this committee. Senator Shatner.
Well, and I think in the effort of fairness, that minority leadership should also be included in that.
I don't know how that's typically done in standing committees. Minority leadership, is that advice and consent?
There's probably no uniform practice on that to recommend to you.
Okay,
Just make your best decision.
okay.
All right, one more.
Yep, go ahead.
Wisconsin Reading Coalition.
Okay. So, content, are we going to be spelling content out to the extent that, to what extent? Illinois talked some about content. What did it say that in Illinois?
In Illinois, vis-a-vis content, they stated, "The handbook shall include, but is not limited to, guidelines for teachers and parents or guardians on how to identify signs of dyslexia, a description of educational strategies that have been shown to improve the academic performance of pupils with dyslexia, and a description of resources and services available to pupils with dyslexia, parents or guardians of pupils with dyslexia."
And that's more prescriptive than the first one that you had put together, or the first one that you had read to us from.
The first one was from Alabama, and they actually did not prescribe content at all, rather just the audience for whom the guidebook was for. So the full statement from Alabama is, "The Alabama State Department of Education, working with the Dyslexia Advisory Council, appointed by the State Board of Education, shall develop and maintain a dyslexia resource guide for the use of local education agencies, public schools, teachers, and parents." So there is no information at all about content in Alabama's example.
Is content important? Show of hands for yes. Content important in terms of us prescribing legislation where, we dictate to that level. Is content or specifying any kind of content important, or is it more important that the task force be correct? I said show of hands, no one's showing hands, so it must not, but dialogue.
What would the other one look like?
Well, legislation can either say, you're going to have within the handbook this content, these aspects of what we're dealing with, or just go make a handbook. And, go ahead, Deb.
I think if your committee is well-balanced, you're going to come out with the content that you need, and it's going to be something that's going to be usable. I think you can prescribe content, but in my experience, sometimes too much prescribing leaves out things that are really important. And if you get a good group together that is truly balanced, all of those features are going to come to the surface, and probably more than you would ever consider.
That is my knee-jerk as well, that it's more important that the committee be comprised properly, that is actually going to dig deep into this, because it's going to be more than a 1/2-hour afternoon, discussion with regards to this guidebook. This is going to be a task force that I don't want to serve on, because it's going to take a lot of time.
I think we can do both. I think we can say that because saying that it must include certain things doesn't mean it can't include a whole bunch of other things that the committee figures out needs to be in there. And my concern about not giving some guidance to content is that some of the content we might prescribe is likely to be the most difficult issues for them to address, and they may choose just to avoid it. And I don't want them to do that.
Well, and that is a good point, Senator Shatner.
I think if we get a room together of all these experts, they would be the ones that would be able to come up with a definition of dyslexia based on all their expertise and, what a struggling reader looks like to help guide the process of the book.
If there is a piece of content or two what would that look like?
I think part of it depends on how it's worded and how it's directed. What we just heard was a directive. You must include all of these components, but it's not limited to. You can provide the task force with suggested content and let that group then determine what the content is going to be. At least then they have some guidance or direction, but it's not being mandated. People are much more engaged if they are creating it themselves than responding to somebody forcing them or mandating them
Yeah.
to do it.
Well, we certainly can't spell out, in my estimation, the prescriptive nature of a handbook down to the T, but we could give some high level, it should include this or that. Now, I don't know, go ahead, Dr. Warren.
Read the list, the Illinois list of what they said must include, because they seem pretty
High level?
broad, high level. It wasn't very prescriptive, but yet I agree with Steve that if I think we need to decide what the goal of the guidebook is, and then make sure that that's what we ask the task force to put in there, and then they can add whatever else they want. Because, again, if they get to a point where nobody can agree and they throw up their hands and give up, and it's not mandated, then they'll be allowed to say, no, we couldn't come to an agreement on that, so we've left that part out. So I do think we need to be pretty clear about what our goal is for the guidebook, what we hope that it will achieve, and then what are critical pieces that need to, critical topics, that need to be in there to make sure that we achieve what we think it should achieve. Anyway, go ahead.
So again, in Illinois, there are 3 components for contents that they want. So 1 is guidelines for teachers and parents or guardians on how to identify signs of dyslexia. 2, a description of educational strategies that have been shown to improve the academic performance of pupils with dyslexia. And 3, a description of resources and services available to pupils with dyslexia, parents or guardians of pupils with dyslexia, and teachers.
So did anyone have a problem in this group with any one of those 3? I certainly didn't. I think it needs to have the third one for certain and the others, but go ahead.
Again, I think it is the manner in which we give direction or the manner in which we prescribe what we'd like the group to do. I think those, I agree, I think those are excellent guidelines. And I would think you get a group of experts together with those guidelines, even if you didn't give them the guidelines, I bet you they'd come up with the same
They'd probably come
thing.
up with them just by
Right.
default, because you're going to have resources there, you're going to have that. I don't know, is it, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to make sure that we don't just focus purely on the word dyslexia and include struggling reader, because I think they both go hand in hand.
Go ahead, Kathy.
I'd like to agree with Dr. Weber, is it? Because my experience is in line with, if you have a group of experts together, agreement is important. And if they're not agreeing, that's going to be an issue. So by giving some suggestions also leaves room for, are we saying it's the Illinois guidebook and not this guidebook? They will have critical conversations about what this guidebook should and can do. They will have critical conversations about the different perspectives. And I think that's what I heard in the beginning, what was important about the process, and then the product, and then what Nancy said, how folks get behind it.
Do you have what you need to put? What do you need? Because we've only got one topic covered yet. And we're halfway through.
So we need to decide about the entity that decides the membership, and an idea that was discussed, but I don't know if there was consensus, was whether that would be the Speaker of the Assembly and the President of the Senate, but I don't know if there was consensus about that, or if there were other ideas about who would decide membership of the Advisory Council.
I like that because that is normal process. Am I correct?
That is something.
There's precedent for that.
There's precedent for that. The co-chairs, what do you?
That was another idea for who the designate of who would decide membership.
You could pause for 5 minutes if you want to discuss it with us.
Why don't we do that? Why don't we take
I turned off your mic.
couple of minute break and, let's take a couple of minute break and then come back to, in about 3 or 4 minutes. I need to consult with the Vice Chair and Ledge Council, so what,
That completely takes all the power in a partisan.
that's what I don't like,
Nobody
yeah.
wants it to be one person.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just wonder if you had one figurehead from each that afterwards as co-chairs to select the members. They're looking at how that shows.
Yeah.
And guys, everybody feels that are those the only and unless they're both equally represented, it'll never get done. So it's
I like that. So like the idea.
Would be the final arbiters of the membership. I don't know, if our Department of Education is not involved at all, would they be overseeing this? They'd host it?
You could have it be.
Are those the only two
You could have
stakeholders?
it be chaired by DPI and have each of those organizations pick a vice chair.
That,
Who
I
then
think,
selects
is
the members.
better.
Don't give, I think you don't want DPI, you should want them to.
Yeah, I agree.
If they don't mind, so why can't we do it just?
So what are you, what is your recommendation? What you just said, reiterate that.
What I just said was that this is the people who have served on the DPI being in charge of it would be most concerned with who's members. They wouldn't mind the members
So still it'd be the kind of thing where IDA and WSRA would work under the auspices of DPI?
It's our education agency.
How do you put that in the proposal? Do you want to, can you articulate that well
What I
enough?
would want to do is probably call over to Ellen and have them tell me, because she knows how she was directed.
Okay. Can you bring one or two options with regards to that for legislation for us to consider?
I think we're not broad, we're gonna have no impact on kids with dyslexia. Because kids with dyslexia still get 75–80% of the.
Because that I think would be the best thing is to say, okay, we have
I think you
this.
could leave that, you could
So if we
work
don't
out the
address
rest of the
that,
details on what we
And then
want
the
to
point I
guide
always come back to is,
today and
you know,
have that
places like Florida,
proposal and then
Massachusetts,
just leave out
institute changes that
the
try to
membership
affect the kids at
and
the bottom of
discuss
the
further
dyslexic,
the
struggling
options that
leaders,
we
how
come up
we make that
Yeah.
distinction.
Well, or
When they implemented
membership
those changes, the
does not
number of
have
kids
to
who read it, the exams.
how it's
So would
decided.
both of those entities have then final approval
So, I mean,
of the committee?
something like that.
Because I think that may be a direction more to have
data
them
and
both.
evidence to show that,
Because
you
here's
know,
the
what
other thing.
benefits the kids at the bottom, benefits the kids at the top. You don't need something different.
That's a tiebreaker.
They may need it at a different pace or a
But
different
this
intensity.
is a very
But
unique situation.
fundamentally,
The
they need the same
dynamic
thing.
has got to be such that the one thing.
I want the whole thing.
When you're done, they're gonna get
And I think there's lane, and
They
I'm not.
have to include each other.
So if
in
they
the
both
brief.
have
The other thing I
approval,
think,
but they
you know,
both
talk
have
out
to
loud,
agree on
people listen.
approval of the
I think
committee
would surprise
membership.
people, that always care about.
And DPI would be the host.
I don't think there's a great
Yeah, I'm just
need
picturing that
to narrow
triangle.
down the definition.
I'm trying
I
to think
that
through
there's
how-
multiple definitions.
But I think we should
we
get
come up
creative among
really
us
mad.
and then deadlines. Yeah, no, there's no way.
But I agree having them.
Nobody says literacy is a useless concept because we have 15 different definitions.
So deadlines,
It's a new conversation.
Yeah.
deadlines would be
Yeah, we need to know
6 months after,
whether there's a deadline for producing it, whether there's a deadline for updating it and reviewing it.
6 months for picking a task force. Is that enough time?
Sure. And then another year probably to produce a guidebook.
Yeah, and then every 4 years to update.
It's up to, I mean, some places do like every year or two. Some places don't have, it's just a temporary thing and then it ends.
Okay, I'm going to bring it back together here. I apologize for needing to consult on one hand. On the other hand, consultation is what makes us all better. So what I think we will do, because we are halfway through our afternoon and we are on topic number 1, is we will have Legislative Council put together a couple of different options for the ways committees are selected, and we will look at those at our October 23rd meeting. I think they have some novel ideas that has kind of been a tentative meeting for some time, and I don't know that we've actually announced that. We reserved it. I don't know that we actually formally published it yet because we were waiting to see how this meeting went, and I think we will need that. But Legislative Council will put together a couple of different options for us to consider for how the, not only the committee is comprised, but who is the final arbiter. I think they've got some good novel ideas. We'll have a look at those next time. They will talk to the drafters to figure out exactly how to best put that in words, and then we will consider that at that time. We do still want to quickly talk about, and I think it should be fairly quickly, typically legislation is, after the date that it is signed, they give you X amount of days to comply, or X amount of months. Is 6 months a fair time to have a task force selected and seated, and then another year to put together a guidebook? These are just numbers I'm throwing out to get dialogue started. If you give too much time, it's not good. If you give too little time, I would see 6 months as being a good place. Is there agreement on that? I don't see anyone disagreeing. You all can speak up? No. So, okay, let's put that in.
Work tends to expand to fill the time allotted.
That's correct, yeah. Yep.
Turn into a 2-year project, it becomes a 2-year project.
Yep. And I'm just looking at the way the legislative cycle shakes out. It would seem to make sense to me to do that as well, although I guess legislation only happens on the early end. Is a year enough time to produce a guidebook if you have a motivated task force that's in place? I don't see any disagreement there. The content of the book is, I had asked Legislative Council to have, like an option 1 and option 2 relative to that. But did I or did I not?
No, that's
I just thought it.
just
Okay.
the, who decides
Yep,
membership.
okay, you're right. So are we,
Updated every, how often?
let's talk one more deadline thing. Updated how often? Some states have every 4 years the handbook gets looked at. Is that too long a period of time, too short a period of time? Is that about right? Does it ever need to be updated? I think the answer to the final question is yes, it should be reviewed, looked at, updated. Minimum 3 years, so. So every 3 years rather than every 4, okay. 3-year review. We can put that in and shoot it out of, and change it as we get the draft put together. We decided this already, didn't we?
Yeah, you might want to clarify that that's the intended audience.
And the intended audience for this book, just for clarification for Ledge Council, is parents, guardians, teachers, administrators, correct? Is there anybody else? I mean, those are broad categories, teachers and administrators especially. They could be anywhere in the scope and spectrum. Okay. Are we done with guidebook? For now.
For now.
Oh,
Talk about it.
yeah,
Do you have a question?
Sure.
go ahead, sorry.
One more suggestion, and we don't necessarily have to add it, but we should be cognizant of the large number of paraprofessionals that work directly with kids that struggle. And there needs to be, and we should give some consideration, training of those paraprofessionals also, or at least training by the teacher to the paraprofessional.
I would add that on the minimally prescriptive language, the word that came to me during the break was that instead of directing the committee to, for instance, define dyslexia, that we direct them to address a definition of dyslexia. So whatever that means. If they decide that it's going to be a very clear definition, if they decide they're going to discuss multiple definitions, if they're going to decide that they want to discuss dyslexia as a spectrum, but they're going to address the question of defining dyslexia, that they're going to address the question of effective intervention, that they're going to address the question of, for instance, the interface between dyslexia and core reading, that they're going to address these things. But then they
So-
can decide how they want to address them.
Rather than talking about a definition of dyslexia, actually rolling that in as a component of what is addressed in the guidebook. I like what you said, I can't repeat what you said.
Just the idea that instead of telling them that the guidebook will include, for instance, rather than being so prescriptive to say that it will define dyslexia, that it will address definitions of dyslexia, it will address the definition of dyslexia, which could be, the way they choose to address it could be broad, it could be narrow, that they will address these things.
Okay. Does that make sense?
You would need to
Is
take
it,
the measure of whether there's consensus on that.
sorry about that. Is there, yes, I apologize. It sounded like such a good idea, I said, done. But that's not just up for me, is it? Does that, does what Stephen said, is that something that we should do in a guidebook, the way he put it? Go ahead, yes, speak.
I think it's an excellent idea because if this group or this task force comes together like we're thinking of, what better group to define and describe dyslexia than that group?
Go ahead.
I'd just like to bring forward to the group again, Donna had mentioned earlier that our presentation from the Education Commission of the States mentioned 9 different components of guidebooks from all of the various states. And that does include, many of them, a definition of dyslexia, characteristics of dyslexia, screening process and tools, interventions and instructional strategies, teacher and parent resources, information on the special education evaluation and assessment process, and state policy requirements and overviews. I think those 9 areas would serve the purpose of answering parents' questions, teachers' questions, of defining dyslexia, coming to consensus as a state on what we will commit to. So I would like to recommend those 9 areas as the guidelines. And another,
Yeah, we'll need to get consensus on that, but let's stay on the topic of what Steve said for just a brief moment. Are you done with that piece, or are you?
I have one other
Go ahead.
addition potentially.
Go ahead.
Well, the other thing that we've discussed is the idea of early literacy, and that's a topic later in our agenda today, but I don't believe there's any guidebooks for early literacy. And wouldn't it be amazing if childcare providers and birthing centers and hospitals had a pamphlet or guidebook that they could give parents about early literacy? That, I think that's an area that we need to have talked about also considering, and does that also belong within the guidebook?
Kathy, I think you had something to.
When we look at guidebooks and when the presentation about what, kind of a compilation of the 9 categories. That could be very prescriptive, particularly depending on the composition of the group, because we do know there's wide perspective. So there's some, a little bit of concern about how prescriptive this would be. And that was and I had a question actually to ask for clarification from Dr. Weber, and that was my original hand up. But then when Nancy was stating those 9 areas, then that really does become prescriptive. Then we're telling the group what this guidebook will look like. But I had a question for Dr. Weber too, so.
Go ahead.
I just would like clarification about paraprofessionals, because we do know that expertise matters, and we're hoping that in Standard C, we acknowledge that reading teachers need to be working with our most struggling readers. So I'm wondering about that comment about paraprofessionals.
Paraprofessionals work so directly with the students, we sometimes overlook the training that they need to support the teacher, to support the reading specialist, to support whomever. It has to do with the needs of the students, what service they need to be provided. I'm not suggesting at all that a paraprofessional could replace a reading specialist. They have become more and more a critical component of schools, especially serving kids with special needs.
Especially in special ed, yeah.
In interest of moving this along, 2 more quick things on the guidebook. I think quick things. Distribution on the DPI website, I'm assuming, and not necessarily print copies of it, right? How about individual school districts? Go ahead.
I guess, well, first of all, as far as distribution, I think if we have a good group of partners that come together to create this, I would hope
It'll
that
be-
all
yeah.
of them would be willing to host it so that it would be available in a variety of places. And I think anytime DPI provides something, school districts, if they find it useful, often do link to that or provide that. There was one other thing I thought of in response to Nancy and talking about early childhood. There is an organization called Wisconsin Early Childhood Collaborating Partners, and I believe they have representation at DPI as well. They deal with our preschools and kindergartens and especially 4-year-old kindergarten, and I think having a representative from there on this group would be very important.
The final thing, I think, is, should this task force be tasked with addressing the definition of dyslexia? They could choose to not address it. They could choose, but they would be tasked with what it was that Stevens said there.
Addressing the definition, that doesn't mean they're gonna come up with a definition.
Yeah, and it doesn't, but it basically just means that we're kicking that to them.
And I want to say very transparently, the reason I word it that way is because I think the kerfuffle over the many definitions of dyslexia is a red herring. There are many definitions of literacy, that doesn't seem to be a problem. There are many definitions of a lot of things, and yet the concept remains very useful to people. I think there are very obvious and simple explanations for why one person says dyslexia is 20% of the population, somebody else says it's 3%. Those aren't hard things to understand. So I think we can address that without saying this is dyslexia and this is
Yeah,
not.
and I think that this group is, although it is very, a good group, I think that the nature of this group is to not necessarily say this is what dyslexia is. Let's let that be part of a process that is much more deliberative and thorough. Representative Stuck.
Yeah, well, I don't know, I guess, well, first of all, did we agree that this was going to be for just people with dyslexia and people who just have a hard time reading but aren't defined as dyslexic?
That's
right?
kind of the scope of what we've been charged to do in this study committee.
Because I'm just
so.
curious, but first of all, for defining dyslexia, if it's something that's for people with dyslexia and people who may just struggle with reading but aren't dyslexic. But also, I mean, I guess I just have a little concern with this group defining it. I mean, we certainly have a lot of people, you know, parents and things that I don't, I mean, yes, they struggle with it, they deal with it, but I don't know, are these right people to be defining it? And if we set a definition that disagrees with other definitions that are out there nationally or whatever, I mean, is that going to be a problem or even more confusing for parents if we have a definition, there's other definitions?
That's
other
why I'm
places?
not comfortable in defining it in this study committee, but allowing the task force that's put together to put together the handbook, to give that as one of their possible, one of the things that they will do is to actually say, do we address it and how? So that we're not making that decision, because I feel uncomfortable in us doing that in an afternoon. I think that would be foolhardy for us to come up with legislation today or tomorrow that would say, this is how we define dyslexia. It's too big a debate for that. We can't do that in this body. So that takes care of two issues off of the, do we have consensus basically on allowing this task force, the task force that is created for the purpose of putting together a guidebook to address dyslexia, per what Stephen Dykstra said? Okay, what's that?
It's whether it should require them to do that.
Require them to address, yes, to require them to address. Yeah. I'm seeing all nods, so,
Yes.
okay. Yep, good. The second thing is defining, or the dyslexia specialist at DPI. I think that's something that was, if I remember my notes correctly, the second most agreed upon thing that we conversed about just before lunch. There was some concern that, that this may be duplicative, and I don't know, I guess let's just discuss that. I personally find the idea to be a good one, to have someone that is at DPI that is, you know, completely knowledgeable and immersed and educated with regards to this. There is also a concern, I suppose, that if the wrong person is put in, that it could actually be worse. So this, of course, requires, highly likely would have a fiscal note attached to it, which basically means it would cost the state money to do. So it may be a little bit of a heavier lift than the guidebook, but I don't think that sometimes agencies can take these up within their current budgets as well. I don't know, but that's neither here nor there. Is this an idea that is a good idea? Should we pursue this? Go ahead, Representative Stuck.
I guess maybe more so a question for the group, just in terms of some of the reading specialists that I spoke to about this idea, raised the concern that DPI is sort of far removed from what they do. They're more at administrative level than working with them directly on what they're doing in the classroom, I guess kind of overviews what they were saying. So I guess I'm just not sure what this would look like if people have ideas in terms of on the ground, how this person would actually be interacting then with classroom teachers or reading specialists.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good point. One of the considerations that I have is if you put together a guidebook that doesn't have an 800 number attached to it, which I think it should, you know, some kind of a place to call. Okay, if I run up against it and I really don't know, I would see one of the functions of a specialist at DPI to be the one who's on the other end of that phone call in some fashion or form, not necessarily sitting by the desk waiting for that phone to ring. But I see that as being part of the guidebook process, the process to primarily work with the same people the guidebook does, teachers and parents. But I don't know, you
I guess maybe, so you see this more of as a, or again, a resource for parents necessarily than guiding or instructing the teachers specifically?
Well, this would be a Swiss Army knife person that would do everything and better than any of the rest of us could. So, all of the above, really. I mean, that it would be a big task, I think.
Fitting that into DPI is problematic in the sense that DPI's position on these kinds of decisions, these kinds of instructional curricular decisions, has always been that local districts decide, DPI doesn't tell you what to do. Even if you ask for guidance, DPI typically provides no guidance. You tell us what you want to do, we'll help you do it, so that 5 districts can choose diametrically opposed positions, and DPI will support all of them equally. That's typically been the way DPI has performed. So this would be a radical departure from that.
Well, and we have, I guess, looking at our state, we have local control, or at least we try to within education, and that's one of the reasons why DPI does that, is because they're allowing that. But that's, Donna, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I printed this off last night. These are the vacancies. This is the whole special ed team from DPI, and currently, the learning disability consultant is vacant, and the IEP support consultant is vacant. So those are 2 critical positions that don't even have anyone in there right now. So I think the need for a dyslexia specialist that's highly trained, I want to emphasize that, because a reading specialist training is not the same, and the reading teacher is not the same as the dyslexia specialist. The training is much more intense, much more in-depth.
Go ahead.
How prescriptive is the dyslexia specialist, and what kind of training and who provides that training for dyslexia specialists?
Well, and there again, when you're devising legislation, you could say DPI shall employ a dyslexia specialist, and you could leave it that generic, or you could say DPI shall employ a dyslexia specialist with XYZ credentials, et cetera, et cetera. My tendency would be to be less prescriptive rather than more so. But maybe there could be a component of, boy, now this is really a can of worms, but I got to open it. Having the task force be giving advice and consent as to who that might be. I mean, I don't know if that's even possible, but that's, you know.
So that brings up one of my questions that I need to have you all think about and answer by the time we finish up, is actually whether we want to draft one bill with all of the suggestions all together, or a package of separate standalone bills. And it could be that you decide to have them interlocking with initiatives that fit together. The other thing I will offer is I have the Minnesota example if you want to hear what they have specified.
Go ahead, please do that. Yeah.
Okay, so in the Minnesota statute, which prescribes the position filled by the specialist who spoke to us at our last meeting, it says the purpose, definition, and requirements. So there are 3 aspects of this statute that are spelled out in the law. First, the purpose. The department has to employ a dyslexia specialist, to provide technical assistance for dyslexia and related disorders, and to serve as the primary source of information and support for schools in addressing the needs of students with dyslexia and related disorders. The dyslexia specialist shall also act to increase professional awareness and instructional competencies to meet the educational needs of students with dyslexia or identified with risk characteristics associated with dyslexia, and shall develop implementation guidance and make recommendations to the commissioner consistent with the other parts of the statute, to be used to assist general education teachers and special education teachers to recognize educational needs and to improve literacy outcomes for students with dyslexia or identified with risk characteristics associated with dyslexia, including recommendations related to increasing the availability of online and asynchronous professional development programs and materials. Now, the definition of a dyslexia specialist. For purposes of this law, a dyslexia specialist means a dyslexia therapist, licensed psychologist, licensed speech-language pathologist, or certified dyslexia training specialist who has a minimum of 3 years of field experience in screening, identifying, and treating dyslexia and related disorders. And finally, the requirements, this is sort of a job description, a qualifications list for the job description. A dyslexia specialist shall be highly trained in dyslexia and related disorders and in using interventions and treatments that are evidence-based, multisensory, direct, explicit, structured, and sequential in the areas of phonics, phonemic awareness, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. So that's just one state's example of how they defined a dyslexia specialist position. And that's a short one compared to the other one.
I think that's outstanding. I think that's outstanding. I think if we're going to do it, it needs to be at that level of specificity or more. I don't think you can just say, hire somebody and call them a dyslexia specialist.
Anybody else? Yeah.
There are organizations out there that certify people as dyslexia specialists, like ALTA, American Language Therapy Academy, I think it is, and IDA, two that I know of. And then people have certain letters behind their name, like CALT, which is Certified Academic Language Therapist, or ICALP.
Senator Schottner doesn't want to keep going. But I think Kathy was next.
I'm really confused. If we're saying that it is difficult to differentiate between dyslexia and children with reading disabilities, and it depends on your perspective what you use to identify students, then how is someone like a psychologist or speech and language person that has no background in teaching and learning and being a reading specialist going to dictate to reading specialists how to work with children that we cannot quite differentiate between dyslexia and reading disabilities? When reading, as a reading specialist, has quite an extensive background. And I would say, in my career, I have worked with special education students, I have worked with dyslexic students and been successful. So I'm really concerned about how we're identifying it, because it is a certain perspective that has training programs to deal with dyslexia in one specific way. Dr. Donna Scanlon is a dyslexia specialist, but she probably wouldn't, Donna probably would not agree with how Dr. Donna Scanlon works with children, because it may not fit that specific perspective. There are different perspectives on working with children that struggle and that are dyslexic. So that's where the slippery slope is here.
I'm not sure it's a perspective of how you approach a student. It's based on their needs. It's not a, this is what they have, this is their problem area, this is how I'm going to address it. And it's not a perspective, it's based on testing, it's based on data. So I'm not quite sure where you're heading with this with me.
Well, not everybody agrees, I'm sorry. Not everybody agrees with the nature of the types of screening that may be used. There is not agreement across the board on this topic. So when you define a dyslexia specialist as having a certain training, there are different perspectives on that.
If I may. I mean, one of the things I want to clear up is that we're not looking for I don't think we're looking for somebody to distinguish between dyslexia and specific learning disability. There is no difference between dyslexia and specific learning disability. To go back to some of the comments about the DSM from earlier, what the APA meant when they said that dyslexia didn't qualify as a separate condition is as a verifiably separate condition. What they meant is it didn't qualify as verifiably separate from specific learning disability. And then what they wrote in the diagnostic manual was that dyslexia is an alternate term for specific learning disability when the primary problem is decoding. So is decoding and spelling. And then you get to say whether they also have problems with comprehension or not. So some of these concerns are born of misunderstanding, and of misunderstandings that are widespread throughout the field that are repeated over and over and over again. Schools saying, we don't do dyslexia, people saying, how do you tell dyslexia from specific learning disability? And the reason you would want somebody with that kind of training is because they could be the point person and starting to smooth over and address and successfully eradicate those things. You know, the DPI website right now makes a point that dyslexia is a medical diagnosis. Lots of things are medical diagnoses. I don't know why they make a point of saying it's a medical diagnosis. The way that's understood by a lot of districts is that's a medical diagnosis. We don't deal with that because we're not medical people. But that's not what that means. Dyslexia is no more a medical diagnosis than a lot of things that school districts deal with. Farsightedness is a medical diagnosis, yet schools have kids in school that wear glasses. I'm not sure what the concern is. So having somebody who has the right training and, dare I say, the right perspective to recognize those things and help to smooth those things over and take the lead on those things. I think if you got the right person, and I think that definition gets us the right person, helps to address that. Although I'm very sensitive to what Donna said, that how you treat dyslexia isn't a matter of perspective, it's a matter of science and data. We know what works. You know, if your problem is phonics and phonemic awareness, we know what we're supposed to do about that. We know how to measure that. We know what to do about that.
Okay. I guess I would agree. I'd be very concerned about adding another position with DPI. If you perhaps wanted to put some language into what someone at DPI might have. For example, there is a special education literacy consultant, someone specifically for, is it special education or specific learning disabilities? If you wanted to say that that person should have some certain kind of background, I think that would be one thing. Adding another position to privilege dyslexia over all other disabilities, to me, would be very concerning. And to speak a little bit to what's being said here about, I have repeatedly, and I know many reading specialists in the field who have been told they don't know what they're doing. And I have, like I said, over 35 years of experience and lots of training in lots of different aspects. And I know how to assess a child, I know how to determine their strengths and weaknesses, and I know how to attend to those needs of that child. And just because I don't do it according to a specific way or a specific methodology does not mean that I am not successful. And when someone comes to me as an expert and says, you need to teach this child this way, that is inappropriate.
I'm not suggesting anybody would do that. If you listen to the language, it's as a resource to people. It's not to tell people what they need to do. The other point I would make, and this has come up a number of times, and I'm glad to have a chance to address it, is this notion of privileging dyslexia over other disabilities. If you look at other disabilities that schools deal with, ADHD, physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities, visual disabilities, hearing disabilities, specific learning disabilities, and dyslexia is only one of them. Specific learning disabilities are unique in the sense that IDEA law expects schools to remediate them. Everything else, they have to address them, they have to accommodate them, they have to deal with them, they have to be aware of them. But nobody expects a school to help a blind child see. Nobody expects a child to get a child out of their wheelchair. Nobody expects them to be the fundamental force that treats ADHD. They accommodate it, they're aware of it, they make allowances for it. The reason this is unique is it is the one category of disability under IDEA that schools are expected to treat. They are supposed to be the primary agent to treat it. That's why it deserves special attention.
I think this here really is bringing out just kind of the the meat of the discussion here, but I'm going to take it from the perspective as a health care provider in a school. I can tell you there's far more kids in school that have a hard time focusing on reading in school because they have no breakfast, because they have no lunch, and because they are living with domestic violence and addiction and mental health. And, you know, yes, we can have a dyslexia specialist, but I don't necessarily know that it's going to make a big difference based on my experience of what I saw while I was an employee at a school. There are much bigger problems out there that our kids are dealing with, and I think a dyslexia specialist, in my opinion, is very nice. But there are things that our teachers are dealing with every day that directly impact our students. That simple access to food for breakfast would make their classroom managements a lot easier to handle if they just had something to eat during the day. That's all.
So you're a no on the dyslexia specialist? Just to be clear there, I think that the concern that I would have if we don't pursue some kind of an avenue at DPI, or that's where it would most likely be, is that we put together a guidebook that has no end point, no place to finally say, hey, I want somebody to have a conversation with that is maybe a level above the local school district if there is a problem there. And we've all gotten the letters from people that have have run into the dead end streets because administrators and teachers probably wanted to, just didn't know where to turn or didn't turn somewhere. So that would be my advocacy for having that position. I see hands all over the place. Let's do this. I'm going to start with Brenda and then just work around this way. So
I see reading as a fundamental life skill that someone without the ability to read is headed into all sorts of things that are going to cause their lives to be more difficult. First and foremost, it causes very early, when children aren't learning how to read, they start to become ashamed of that. Mm-hmm. Their behaviors change. There's a lot of children for whom their behaviors are a result of not reading, as opposed to the other way around. I just think that it's. I agree. There's a lot of children dealing with a lot of things in our schools, and our schools have started to become everything to everybody. I mean, in Green Bay Public Schools, we have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We feed our kids all the time, and we are trying to provide for those things. But there's learning how to read is an incredibly complex thing, and it's something that I think historically Wisconsin has not. I mean, we've our ranking among the states for reading has gone down. I just feel like something needs to be done different than just kind of tweaking around what we've already done, because we've not demonstrated the ability to successfully teach our children how to read. And so I just feel that it's so critical for our children, and it's even more critical for our children who aren't don't have enough food and are living in trauma and things like that. If you add to that the inability of reading, you've just multiplied the effects of their trauma and their homelessness and all of the other things that they're dealing with. So I'll stop there.
Scale of 1 to 5, 5. Scale of 1 to 5, 5 being very important. Dyslexia specialist at DPI specifically. Is it a 5 or 1?
Yeah,
It's a 5, very important.
Very important.
Okay. Go ahead.
In terms of having a dyslexia specialist, I feel that if we don't recognize that the whole point of this committee is mute. it's important to recognize the fact that there is dyslexia, that does exist. I mean, if you wanted to, you could do an SLD/dyslexia specialist, but that specialist has to have the right training. They have to have the extensive training that is required for them to do what they do and be effective for kids with, struggling readers/dyslexia. That's all I have to say.
Scale of 1 to 5?
5.
Okay. Brenda, go ahead. Or Nancy, sorry.
That's okay. I will answer to any name. I feel like the conversations that are beginning to happen are representative of the difficult conversations that need to occur, that this task force is going to have. I also think it's representative of the current culture of education in Wisconsin for many reasons. Educators are feeling attacked, students are feeling that they can't find answers, parents are feeling attacked and that they can't find answers, and we could spend 3 hours discussing why as to that. But at the end of the day, we're all here because we believe in the importance of literacy and because we know that what we're doing is not currently producing results for all of our Wisconsin students. And so we do need someone that can support this guidebook and answer questions about them, and that can guide the implementation of it to tease out the differences between a struggling reader and a dyslexic reader and a specific learning disability in reading, and how our MTSS systems can best support them. So I do think that we need that person, whether they're called a dyslexia specialist or a Wisconsin literacy. The word dyslexia seems to shut down conversations, but we need someone that is the expert to help our state tease this out. That said, though, I don't think we can have an unfunded position.
So 3, 4, 5, 1, 2?
5 if funded.
If funded, okay, gotcha. Yep. Go ahead, Senator Shatter.
So we have a bunch of folks that work at DPI that are literacy specialists. Do we have their resumes, their job descriptions? Do we know what they do? Do we know that they're already doing it but don't have the right title? I mean, I just kind of think, is it responsible to just add a position if it's already being done? I think that is really part of the question also. I mean, maybe they're already there and they just don't have the right title.
Well, and that's a good point. One of the things about putting out legislation is this is not the body that's going to decide that and enact it. It goes to a hearing, and in reference to something that Jessica from Legislative Council said earlier as to, is this going to be a singular bill or a package of bills? I personally would envision it being a package of bills where, this is something that is a standalone, and then we can have that conversation at some point along the way with DPI when it comes out, and they can come and make their case. And sometimes, frankly, that's the way good things get done here, is when you put a bill out and you bring something to the forefront of the agency and department and the public. And they say, hey, wait a minute, we want this. And if you bring in parents to testify and those kinds of things, all of a sudden, you don't necessarily have to even move something legislatively and you get good things done. So that's one of the, again, that's kind of the strategy behind one of the ways that I'm seeing this to happen, is to again, this is not the body that will decide that, but go ahead, Michael.
I think it would be important that there's someone at the Department of Public Instruction, regardless of the title, that has training and expertise in dyslexia, and that could be, for lack of a better term, marketed as such, so that schools and reading specialists have someone that they can go to as a resource. They could provide training across the state. There are just so many things that this person could do that would be helpful. And something that we shouldn't overlook, and you mentioned it, is a level above the school district level. For example, we got a great model of that in the area of special education. If there are frustrations with a school district, and parents can then submit a complaint to the Department of Public Instruction, and generally those complaints are resolved to everybody's satisfaction, but it was somewhere for them to go. We have, I think, 2, maybe 3 now, open enrollment consultants at the Department of Public Instruction. They communicate mainly via email. I'm not sure how much all of you know about the complexity and the issues surrounding open enrollment. First of all, I think it's a great piece of legislation. That's my personal opinion, because I helped in the beginning, in the 90s, put that together based on Minnesota's model.
Then it's wonderful.
Yes, it is. But it gives parents a choice. So when districts run across issues in this technical law, we get turnaround from the open enrollment consultants in a day, usually less than 24 hours. So there are some models that DPI has in place that we could ask them to repeat with dyslexia. And maybe it's somebody that's already there. That was, somebody mentioned that. I mean, that's a great point. We don't know what their the knowledge. And one more thing, they have an opening in the area of learning disabilities. Openings, retirements, resignations are always opportunities. So maybe there's something there.
And here I thought I would somehow diss you as a superintendent by saying there should be a level above, and you've agreed with me, so that's good. So 1 to 5, 5 being important?
Let's see. I would say 5, provided there's training, there's financial support for it, and and it's not our job or our charge to tell DPI they need to have that consultant. Take a look at your own staff. I think we need our teachers and our reading specialists and our parents need help in the area of dyslexia. And what can you guys do to help?
We have a half hour left here before our adjournment time. We probably have a half a dozen discussions yet on any number of topics. Do we have enough direction, Ledge Council? You are wanting to say something.
What I have down is, I believe I have heard consensus from the committee that there would be a position, legislation proposing a position in the Department of Instruction, of Public Instruction, titled, what? What would we want the title of that position to be? Would it be a 1.0 full-time position? And does the committee wish it to be funded or done with existing authorization? And then we didn't quite, I don't think I heard a decision about whether specifications would be involved in this law for job duties and for qualifications.
We still do have a lot to discuss relative to this, don't we? Yeah. Well, you know, you always have a lot more resistance from the agency if it's not funded. You always have a lot more resistance from the legislature if it has to be funded. It's just one of those fun things. Kathy, go ahead.
I just have a recommendation, and I don't know, I hear what people are saying. But in the spirit of wanting to work together, I think we want to work with DPI. And I would hate to assume that someone is not addressing this in some way that folks are not aware of. And so I'm wondering if before legislation is crafted, that perhaps before the October 23rd meeting, there would be some conversations at DPI around, I think it would be difficult if I worked at DPI and all of a sudden I heard this legislation and then it's just my role. Now I have to come and testify about that legislation, as opposed to finding out what the special education literacy consultant does. And then maybe bringing that back to the October 23rd meeting.
And I hear what you're saying, and I certainly don't want to be refuting any of that, but what we heard, I believe, last time when we had DPI testify, the two nice ladies that were here, they didn't speak much about dyslexia. There seems to be kind of a quietness with regards to understanding specifically dyslexia within DPI. Again, I don't want to throw them under the bus. I like Dee and Barb, they're great people. But, and the agency is doing, the department is doing a lot of things that are being done well. But I don't think there is the kind of spotlight on dyslexia. So I am more of the opinion myself to say, let's put this out there as legislation and then have them come in at a time when it's forwarded to say, no, we don't need this because we are already doing it with X, Y, and Z and we've beefed this up. That's more my approach. Again, I'm chairing the committee and just directing traffic, not making it my will or nothing, but that's the way I see it. So I don't know. But we had a couple of more decision points that we needed to have on that, and they were, do we need to be prescriptive? Go ahead.
So it's whether it's a full-time position at DPI, whether it should be funded or it's something that would be funded with existing authorization and how much funding, whether or not job duties should be specified and whether or not qualifications of this person should be specified.
Does Minnesota address the last two in what they
Duties
put
and
together?
qualifications?
Duties and qualifications.
Yes, while you were not with us, I actually recited the entire
Yes,
definition.
don't
and
re-recite it
requirements.
all because we're low on time. But
They do have a definition of what a dyslexia specialist is and how the specialist has to be trained.
is there, go
I
ahead.
especially like the fact that they referred to their responsibilities for dyslexia and related disorders, so they're not going to get trapped in the mud about whether something is dyslexia or isn't dyslexia. If it smells like dyslexia, if it's a related disorder or risk factors or common symptoms, yeah, let's go for it.
Is there any improvement that we can make on what Minnesota had done in terms of the way it put it together? Deb?
Speaking, from the perspective of someone in the schools who often has to deal with this, I would want someone who is, while I can understand the need for someone who has the training specifically in dyslexia, that training follows a very narrow path. And I would want that person to also understand the broader aspects of literacy education in the schools and understanding. So ideally, I think that person should be a reading specialist, perhaps with additional training beyond that.
Okay. Is that kind of specificity within the language that we have there? Not really, is it?
No, so let me.
May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
We've heard repeatedly over the last several meetings about the broad depth of knowledge that all reading specialists have. I don't think we need to replicate that in this position. If what we've been told is true, they don't need somebody else to repeat the knowledge to them that we've been told they all have already. What we need is somebody with a very focused, specific category of knowledge to add to the broad base of knowledge that they have to help them in these specific areas.
It's a point understood. Appreciate that. Yeah, let's dispense with what I had asked you about earlier there, and let's go to, should this be something that is funded with additional funds? Should it be one FTE to start with, one full-time equivalent? I believe that makes sense, and looking around the room, I'm seeing shaking of heads for those who think that the position is important at this point.
job that somebody's going to do in one FTE, so I wouldn't want to pay them less than one FTE.
Yeah, and then, the discussion is this something that we would just say to DPI, do this, or would we provide funding for it? If we provide funding for it, then we'd have to decide what kind of level we would want to put in the legislation. If we say DPI do it, we can figure out from them how much that might cost and what the resistance would be. That's just kind of my free flow of thought. What, Representative Stuck, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is fine, but I guess just logistically, just bringing up the fact that they do have some open positions already, sort of, do we know why they're having a hard time filling those or why those are open? Just, I mean, is it we're not paying enough to attract the right candidates? Is it just lack of qualified people to do it? Sort of why are we already having trouble filling some of these positions if we know that? You know, will it impact filling this, or would it require us to maybe pay more or something to attract somebody? So just answering those sort of logistical questions.
And those are excellent questions, and they would make great inquiry during a hearing when, you know, when there's actually a bill there. And I'm not suggesting it's not understood and taken right now. It's just a matter of we can't know that, and where our committee is tasked with is to say, we think this is important or not, and then moving ahead with that legislation. So, go ahead.
Ask DPI, if you want to decide today that you want us to put a number in there and ask DPI what the number should be, you could consult with them before the next meeting.
Okay, and yeah, we could certainly do that. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So is that the direction then from the committee?
Is the direction, can you restate what you would like to?
So if the committee wishes to direct us in this manner, we could leave that number until we have a discussion with DPI and ask them what the salary for a 1.0 FTE should be and put that in the proposal that we bring to the committee.
Yeah. Is that, does that sound reasonable from committee members? Okay, excellent.
And that's funded, right?
And that would be if we're funding it.
That's the consensus I heard from the committee.
Yeah.
Funded, okay.
Yep. Mhm. Is there anything else on the, that position? Go ahead.
Job
I'm sorry, but I'm wondering if we could, in having our discussion with DPI, ask that Mike Thompson be the DPI person that we talk with.
Okay.
I'm just thinking of someone in the hierarchy of DPI that has a broader feel for the department and has been there for a while. That's just a thought.
And you can make a note of that.
Whatever the committee wishes.
Is that something that makes sense? Does anyone have a problem with that? I think I have met Mike at one point along the way, but I'm not sure the context anymore. Likely something having to do with his job. So,
And then do you want to specify duties for the position?
do we want to specify duties for this position, or is that, go ahead, Ann.
I think it's most important to define qualifications,
Qualifications as contrasted with duties?
or both. I just wanted to make sure I got that in there before we run out of time.
Both. What are the duties then?
Copy Minnesota.
Copy Minnesota sounds good to me. Yeah, okay. That, I don't see any dissension in that.
I think we should beat Minnesota when the Badgers play them in football, but other than that, we should copy.
Not a tie? Ties are so boring, aren't they? What is the next thing that was, actually, this happened to be the second most positive responses to the guidebook, and I jumped ahead with the dyslexia specialist, and I apologize, I guess that's chair privilege, but is professional development. What does that look like? How can we deal with that in the time that we have remaining? I guess I am going to open it up. Many of you, numbers of you mentioned that as we went around the room early on.
By professional development, do you mean professional development as they talked about it as a requirement for continuing education requirement for teachers? Because currently nothing is required?
When I compiled the notes, just roughly over lunch break for the chair, I heard both continuing education and new new licensed, newly licensed teachers. And I also heard a desire to revisit the lifetime licensure. All three of those were repeated by several members.
And fast track.
Is there any input on that? Shall we take up that topic? I guess as I'm thinking about it here, and this is kind of stream of consciousness, so forgive me a bit, but we just in the last budget cycle changed some of the licensure things. The chance that that would change back because of that is probably fairly minuscule. Especially from, in that short amount of time. So is that something that pays for us to even take up here, or?
We could
Go ahead.
just to insert a suggestion, we can, in addition to proposals, legislative bills, this committee can produce recommendations if it desires to. So if, for instance, there was a desire to express the committee's emphasis on the importance of revisiting that issue in the future, that could be something that could be placed in recommendation language.
Okay. That's helpful. Is that something that is a consensus of the committee?
Yes.
We have people agreeing that this is good, this is good. Go ahead.
I think that's an excellent idea, because different school districts have different levels and different requirements for professional development. I would hope that none of the 425 districts would use that life license not to provide professional development for their staff. And before we take that issue up, I would like to do a little more research with other school districts. I know what we do, but I don't know what others do. And all of our teachers are required to have 10 days of professional development during the school year. But I don't know where that level is with other districts.
So, again, I wasn't part of that. That was part of the budget. Obviously, I voted for it, but I didn't get into the understanding of it. But is it correct that maybe some school districts were actually asking for that flexibility in rural areas or in other areas where? So school
Most
districts
definitely.
were asking for that
Yeah,
flexibility?
school districts were asking for flexibility in licensure because of the shortage of teachers, especially in high demand, low supply areas.
Yeah.
So the Department of Public Instruction, and state legislature took up that issue to try to provide more support for school districts to hire staff. Now, how much of that I personally agree with, I mean, that isn't what you asked me, so I won't,
Yeah.
I won't perseverate on it.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think that's a huge equity issue, because I agree with Dr. Weber that rural areas and also perhaps urban areas will have shortages, but to change the licensure, just because you have a license doesn't mean you're highly qualified. And also in the era of budget cuts, one of the first things school districts often cut is funds for professional development. And even though you might have, X number of days, there's a lot of things that the school districts are trying to do to help their educators, K-12, deliver high-quality instruction, and it's not just in the area of literacy. So when you have a professional expectation that you need to, and it's not a guarantee, but it's helpful. Plus, I think the second thing that we talked about today that we see highly problematic is the alternative pathways, the fast track, no expectation for student teaching of any kind. How are these folks that are going into the field supposed to help children that struggle? A dyslexia specialist at DPI is not going to change that situation.
Go ahead.
I would ask for some clarity just for the purpose of drafting a recommendation. If there is perhaps consensus to include in a recommendation both a desire to revisit the lifetime licensure and licensing structure and something regarding the alternative licensure that may not include student teaching and not include some of the requirements that otherwise were part of the licensure process.
So you're looking for consensus for those two. I guess, do we, go around and yes, no, or
I think she wants to clarify.
go ahead.
Just one
Sorry.
more
Yeah.
was that band of licensure from K to 9. That's an enormous licensure band. Teaching kindergarten and first grade is so different from teaching 8th grade and 9th grade.
Have you seen those kids?
Yes, I'm in those classrooms all the time.
So is this something that we want to do as a formal recommendation, these 2 or 3 topics? Is that worth our time? And there I'm being just real blunt, but
My time is yours. I'll be happy to spend time drafting it if directed to do so.
you would think you would be political. That was such a political answer. Dr. Weber?
I agree with professional development. I think that's critical. I cannot agree with revisiting the licensure issue again. It was just visited for 2 or 3 years at the legislative level. A decision was made and we're moving forward with it. And I also think if this committee starts investigating that, it may pull us away from what our original mission was. So I can't go along with that.
That really puts in exact form what I was thinking. That doesn't mean that you and I comprise the entire committee, though, so I want to be sensitive to that as well, but go ahead, Stephen.
I feel like we would be missing, I understand that it is unlikely that a recommendation would lead to anything, but it may lead to something a year or 2 or 3 or 4 years down the road. The fact is that these changes in licensure weren't made all at once and in a way that was thought out at one time. It was a series of changes that sort of overlapped with each other. We're in a situation now, and they made the point earlier, that you can now, we passed a law a number of years ago that said you had to pass the foundations of reading test to teach kids reading. You don't have to pass it anymore. There's paths to teaching where you don't have to do that. You can say that this is because of a shortage of applicants, but if you get 10 applicants for a position and 9 of them pass the foundations of reading, 1 never took it and came in without any student teaching from an outside program, you're free to hire that person. There's no requirement that you show that you really need this, that you're in a desperate situation. It's really an insult, I think, to students who do the student teaching, who pass the foundations of reading tests, who take the time to do that, who make the effort to do that things, and then maybe losing out on open positions to people who don't have those qualifications, never took the test and didn't bother to do those things. It's just not, it's no way to run a business. So I think,
Go ahead,
I
Donna.
would like us to express some opinion on that.
I think if we don't address it as a recommendation, we are being remiss in addressing a very important point. I mean, whether anything happens, that's up to the legislation, but, legislators, but if we don't, we're remiss, and shame on us.
And what we'll do is have Legislative Council draft up several recommendations, and they will be available for us to vote on at the next meeting. I think that's the way that we will handle that. So we are nearing the end of our prescribed time. I don't know that we covered everything to the extent that we could have. On the other hand, we did cover the guidebook, and that was something that was universal, I think, and as well as the professional development piece and the dyslexia specialist piece. What is the the strategy and the next piece here, if Legislative Council could let us know kind of what you're going to be doing behind the scenes, is that possible? And then when to, looking at October 23rd for the next meeting and what that will comprise. Can you do that?
I can. So the plan is to go back to the Legislative Reference Bureau. We have been in consultation with the drafters. So far, just looking at the rough topic areas identified by the committee leading up to this point. And so we tried to address some of the questions they had with regard to what would go into a proposal. And we will circle back with them. We will work with the chair and the vice chair and create a proposal. We do need, before we leave, to know whether you'd like each of the items we've discussed to be in its own bill or in one large bill. So you'll either have one draft or a series of drafts to consider, and those will be released along with our regular materials a week ahead of time with the agenda for our October 23rd meeting. And so you'll have the opportunity to review them, to prepare your thoughts, to contribute, and then it will be the chair and vice chair's decision what additional discussion of other topic areas we may wish to continue at that time,
Yep.
and the committee's future meeting dates.
Very good. Senator Shatner, do you have anything to add to that, or?
I'm looking forward to what you guys come up with. I have to admit, I thought it was going to be much more contentious, and it was not. I think we're a group that are ready to work together on this topic, and I'm excited to see where we're going in the future. At the end of the day, everything we do, we have to remember, do no harm, and our people that we're working with are the little people and the people that someday will be taking care of us. So we have to always remember that, we're setting the rules and they're the ones that are going to be taking care of us someday. So we need to remember that in that. So I look forward to seeing what legislation looks like.
And the decision point that we have that I was searching my mind for when I threw it to Vice Chair Shatner is one bill or multiple bills and recommendations. Representative Rohrcast, thank you for joining us. How was your other study committee?
Sorry, I was not here. I'm on a steering committee with DHS. They're sponsoring a long-term plan for Alzheimer's and dementia issues in the state. So that's what took me away from this today. So I apologize for that, but I have a comment. I think it might be better to split the bills up. When I headed up that task force on Alzheimer's and dementia, we specifically did that because we were afraid of if there's an issue with one, it could easily kill another that might have otherwise gone through. So that would be my comments.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That would be my belief and opinion as well. Are there any dissensions to that? Looks like everyone is in agreement that it should be a series of bills and recommendations, so excellent.
All right, well, just to give you one more, challenge, if you want to address whether or not these bills will change anything for charter and parental choice schools, that's another question drafters often have. And so it may or may not be something you're prepared to decide on right now, but it will be asked either in the process of preparing the proposals for your consideration next time or alongside that consideration if there's any tweaks that need to be made.
We're not dictating anything to the traditional public schools, so I don't see where it
That was
would make a difference.
my thoughts were that the guidebook is not really, that could be accessible to homeschoolers or anyone and doesn't give direction. The DPI specialists, I'm assuming, would be, or the dyslexia specialist at DPI, is there a place where that would intersect more? I guess I should be asking that question.
Not that I can think of right now.
But just, Yeah.
It always seems to come up at some point in the drafting language, but if that does occur, I will just circle back with the chair for a decision on the fly, but it shouldn't be an issue.
Excellent, excellent. I need to look at, yes, go ahead.
Just to support future thinking, the Read to Lead grants, what have they been able to support in the past? You know, could they support professional development?
Good professional development is very kind of large scale, very expensive. One of the things I wanted to say about professional development is I think, and I spoke way back at the beginning, I spoke to Representative Culp about this. I think we need to set our sights high, and I think we need to go out and try to recruit some really big private money for this. I think when you look at the things that went on in Mississippi, part of what drove that was private money. That money exists in Wisconsin. I think there's money in Wisconsin that's interested in this topic, but I think we would have to be very focused and very impressive to recruit that money.
I have a technical point.
Go ahead.
So the legislation, the law that exists for the Read to Lead grants does specify that it has to be used for entities to support literacy and early childhood development programs. I'm not sure how broad that could be construed.
Could I add one comment? Because
go ahead.
we talked about trauma, and trauma came up a lot today, and I wanted to share something just in a couple of minutes. I work a lot with trauma, and a good friend of mine is a guy named Don Meichenbaum, who's one of the giants of psychotherapy and one of the giants of the field of trauma, and has been for 50 years. And it's a privilege to know him, and he's now the director as he's retired from his faculty position. He's the scientific director of an agency in Miami called the Melissa Institute for the Prevention of Violence. The Melissa Institute has looked at a lot of data. He's consulted to the UN and most of the countries in the world on violence and trauma and the effect that it has on children. And Don's conclusion after all those years is the number one thing you do for a child who's been traumatized, the most important thing you do for them, is teach them to read. It's remarkable to hear him say, this is a man who's developed whole fields of psychotherapy. He says more important than that is to teach them to read, because if you've been traumatized and abused, your life is going to be hard, but you have a chance to recover from that. If you've been traumatized, abused, and you go to school and you can't read, you're pretty much doomed. So that was a remarkable moment when he told me that, and I wanted to share that with everybody.
Yeah. We have the final item on our agenda is other business. And seeing none, the final one is adjournment. So stay tuned.